As you may have noticed, there's a catch me if you can structure occurring at the end of Seminar 18. Let's see if we can track it down here in this final lecture in our series. First, I want to start by reviewing what we know so far in Lacan's proto-thinking around men and women. Let's start first with men. All masculinized subjects, except one, are defined by the phallic function. That's what we get from Lacan's two prototypical formulas. What this means is that all masculinized subjects are castrated, and by that we mean limited, constrained, subjected, and subjugated within the normative codes and conventions of the symbolic. You can call it heteronormativity, you can pick your normative logic. What we know about castration applies here to the field of phallic jouissance. That's what we're talking about here. The phallic function is a castrative logic. At this point in Lacan's thought, that's what he means by this capital I with a circle and an X next to it. The phallic function is castrative, which means that enjoyment on those terms occurs in a limited, constrained, subjugated fashion, and 100% of masculinized humans endure this fully, wholly, thoroughly. Now, in order for all men, for all masculinized beings, to hang together, we've seen, as a totalizing complete set, there must be one man who is left out, excluded, excised. In other words, one man who is not castrated, who is not constrained and limited, and so on and so forth. Who is this exceptional man, we asked? Why, it's the so-called real father of the primal horde, of course. This mythical, phantasmatic, and utterly impossible man who enjoys exclusive access to all women, remember that expression, without limit, without constraint, apart from castration. The logic here is rather simple. If everyone is included, no one has been left out. The father of the primal horde is this no one, this no man relative to every man. Hence, all of Lacan's riffs on the father being zeroed out in Chapter 10 of Seminar 18. Let's see if we can track down some of these pages. You'll note this also occurs in a sequence of conversations Lacan's having here around mathematical logic. It's on page 16 of Chapter 10, page 190 of the PDF if you want to go ahead and check this passage out. It looks like he's talking about the Oedipus complex, and then he starts talking about the necessity of zero in order to posit the successor. Zero as necessary for this series. And then he's on to the year zero, and then we get to the father. This is what we're talking about when we speak of the murder of the father. The idea here is that the father has to be zeroed out, subtracted a zero relative to the total count of all men in order for that count to hold together. Lacan talks about this in terms of an n+1. What we're really looking at here is the father as that n, as that 0 point. I like the n, though, as a naught, and I want you to hear naught as N-A-U-G-H-T, but also as N-O-T, because this is also the no thing, the pronouncer of castration, of prohibition, of no. This is the no of the father as well that is zeroed out in this logic. Which brings us to women. If the real father is 0% castrated, and all of his sons are 100% castrated, where do we find all the daughters and wives? Well, they're somewhere in between. In other words, they are more than 0% castrated, but less than 100% castrated. The field of femininity that Lacan is mathematically suggesting here is one in which women are between 1 and 99% subject to the phallic function. And the way we've read that in terms of Lacan's formulas is to say that all feminized subjects are at least partially defined by the phallic function. In other words, greater than 0% defined by the phallic function. But no one woman is wholly defined by the phallic function, which means that to be a woman is to be less than 100% castrated. Which means, if you hear me now, is that there's always something more to women's enjoyment than phallic jouissance. In addition to phallic jouissance, women in this position can access an other jouissance beyond the phallic function, beyond castration, apart from castration. So what this amounts to, in sum, from our last lecture, is that for men there's always someone beyond their experience of limited, castrated enjoyment. But for women, there's always something beyond limited, castrated enjoyment for them to experience. The logical issue here, of course, is one of universalizability. And I want you to really hear the etymology here once again. We've been talking about this off and on since seminar 14. To universalize something is to turn something into one, to turn some things into one thing. Universalization is oneification. Unus, one, and verse meaning to turn. To universalize is to take a collection of entities and turn them into one, to oneify them. And that's really what is happening here. That's the stake that gets Lacan thinking through men and women here. And you'll even recall when he first starts arriving at the woman, he's doing so atop and in the mix with all the women. And all the women is precisely what we hear articulated in the myth of the father of the primal horde. This isn't just about a zeroed out daddy. It's about a totalized mommy. Let's be clear. If the logical issue here is one of universalizability, it's also about the dissymmetrical proportion that we see between men and women around this topic. It's the question, in other words, of that bull's head, that upside down capital A. And the reason why I say that this is central is that this upside down capital A has been with us from the very start of seminar 18. It's right there in the very opening chapters of this seminar, not as this symbolic, logical symbol of universalizability that Lacan uses it when he turns it upside down, but he says as a bull's head, like any other character written in the margins of this wild seminar about writing. Here's the riff. Men are universalizable, and their universalization, like each and every universalization, necessitates an exception. This, what we have in front of us in the field of masculine enjoyment, is a logic of the all. And that's what we've been talking about. That's the relationship between all men and the necessarily subtracted, zeroed out figure of the father. The no man who guarantees the total count that is all men. With women, though, according to Lacan, we do not see a logic of universalizability. And thus, the collectivization of women does not necessitate an exception, because we're not pronouncing a universalization of them, which is exactly why in the parallel formula for women, we see the upside down A with an X next to it, but with a line over the top, that horizontal bar, which is one of negation. Here, the logic is not one of the all, but instead the logic of a not all. That's what that part of the formula indicates. Hence, this upside down capital A with a horizontal bar above it. That's how you would read this in symbolic logic. Which brings me to a bit of speculation. And you know how we like to end these series, not by tying things up in a neat little bow, but by letting a few loose ends hang out. And here I want to take a chance. It's just an imaginative exercise. Because at this point, I'm not quite buying what Lacan is up to with men and women. Logically, I see the bit he's chomping at, but I'm not quite ready to get on that horse and ride yet. Let's do some speculating, though, because he's loose with this at this point in his thought. Seminar 18 is not Seminar 20, and so I want to be loose as well and take some risks here. And I want to take a risk that came up in Friday's totally wild and woolly discussion, where a Dutch international genius undergoing analysis and living a life in Ireland brought up this question. Wait a minute. In Seminar 18, Lacan has a lot to say about all women, all the women, every woman. And yet he wants to say that this is not a universalizable category, the way that all men, every man, is a universalizable category. What's up with that? What if there were such a thing as all women? Lacan, at this point, is very quickly shifting into the woman. But it's in the midst, again, of this talk of all women. Let's see if we can take this wrong path, this path that he detours off when he pursues the woman. What if there were a category, all women? Well, if it was a totalizing category like that of all men, it would necessitate an exception. There would have to be an exception. Someone or something would have to be left out in order for that totalizing complete set of all women to hold. What would be the exception to woman's 1 to 99% relation to phallic jouissance? Father 0%, men 100%, women 1 to 99% castrated. If that 1 to 99% were a universalizable set, what would be the excluded position that would guarantee it? By the same logic of universalization that we've been working with here. On my reading, this exception could only come in two forms, mathematically speaking. The exceptional woman in question could be 0% castrated, in which case the exceptional woman would be equivalent to the father of the primal horde. And I find that a very interesting lead at the end of Seminar 18, especially as Lacan turns, as we will see, to the discourse of the hysteric. The other option is that the exceptional woman in question here could be 100% castrated, in which case she wouldn't be a woman, she'd be a man. So let's take that first option. Not of a 0% castrated being, but of a being that might be parallel to, equivalent to, correspondent with that father in some functional way. And I want to approach this the way Lacan invites us to approach this at the end of Seminar 18, with this return to the discourse of the hysteric. Into this mix of men and women, 0%, 100%, 1 to 99%, Lacan now reintroduces this discourse of the hysteric that pops up and receives lavish attention in Seminar 17. And I think he does this for a good, if bewildering, reason. Let's start by just recalling what he says about the hysteric in Seminar 17. First and foremost, the hysteric appears as symptom, commanded by the unconscious, as the real taking a name at high tide, etc. You can see all of this being played out in Seminar 17. On pages 43 to 44 in particular, you get some great riffs on this. I don't want to dwell too much on it because we've got an entire lecture on the hysteric from our series on Seminar 17. Many of us have been there, done that. Let's just keep moving forward. All I want to do is recall some of these elements that I think carry forward into these final chapters of Seminar 18. The agency of the hysteric, I want to remind you, is that of the symptom. And it's the symptom as we now know it to operate, as we've learned about it here in Seminar 18. It's the symptom in all of its parabolic, wildly sphinx-like, enigmatic structure, like all the litter that is washed up at high tide. This is the deer whose head is turned around with a missing eye, half its fur rubbed off and all of its hooves spray-painted green, that is washed up on your beach. It don't make any sense. It's an odd thing. It is an enigma. If it's a signifier, it signifies what the Sphinx would if it washed up on your beach. And yet, what Lacan points out in 17 is that the discourse of the hysteric leads to knowledge. It's on page 23, if you want to track it down. What do we mean by knowledge? What is this knowledge to which the discourse of the hysteric leads? Now, it's tempting to look at the actual formula, barred subject, addressing S1, and producing S2, and say, there's our knowledge. That's kind of accurate. But it relies on a very careful understanding of what Lacan means by knowledge. It has more to do with the most elaborate form of knowledge we know, which is ignorance, beyond which we only have the knowledge of truth that occurs in the field of the unknown, namely the unconscious. But notice what Lacan is up to here when he says in Seminar 17 that the discourse of the hysteric leads to knowledge. The knowledge he has in mind here is not epistemology. It's not a closed, hermetically sealed tradition or discipline, but instead the limit of any given epistemological system. It's this point where the limit in a discipline, in a discourse, in an epistemology shows up and lends itself to observation, measurement, verification, all the shit we know that happens at low tide when the radical scientific inquirer is out there on the beach measuring and assessing the deer that have washed up. But what Lacan is careful to point out in 17 that we don't get as much of in Seminar 18 is the fact that toying with this limit, dwelling at this limit, walking in the littoral zone, feet and toes in the sand, is a source of enjoyment in the field of radical scientific inquiry. I want to recall for you, in light of all this, the passage on page 67 of Seminar 17 that we spent some time with in our last series, but that also bears mentioning here as well, along the lines of what the hysteric is up to when they speak as symptom, and when their symptomatic agency leads to a kind of knowledge, and when the kind of knowledge in question opens up into a whole where we see not knowledge but enjoyment. Check this out. It's toward the bottom of page 67. It's when he's starting to get into this bit about the theorist as someone who loves truth, loves it because he doesn't want to save it. And then he's got this really wild paragraph toward the bottom that begins, what can it mean to say that by loving truth one thus falls into a system that is so obviously symptomatic? Here one thing is becoming clear. By proposing itself as the residue of the effect of language, as what makes it that the effect of language only extracts from enjoying what last time I was saying about the entropy of a surplus jouissance. This is what one does not see, truth as external to discourse, but what is the little sister of that forbidden jouissance. Now this paragraph is a wonky one. It's one that you need to go back to the French and then retranslate 8 times and see what you can do with that second sentence, the one with all the M dashes running through the English translation we have. I think this is a terrific paragraph, and I wish Lacan would have spent more time elaborating on these points. He doesn't, though. Instead, he latches on to this bit about sisterhood. Notice, I say it's the sister because they are only related by this. If the most radical logical structures effectively attach themselves to this stem that is uprooted from jouissance, the inverse question arises of what corresponds to the enjoying of these conquests in logic that in our day are being made. There is this, for example, that a logical system is consistent, however weak it is, as they say, only by designating its force of effect, of incompleteness, where its limit is marked, to what jouissance does this way in which the logical foundation itself proves to be opening up correspond. In other words, what is truth here? The type of knowledge in question here is knowledge as a process that is always opening up into certain states of incompleteness, inconsistency, where these limits are marked, where these weaknesses are accounted for at the level of the formula, at the level of the matheme, in the shape of letters. Different deer, same spray-painted hooves. And he wants to ask here, where do we see truth in the midst of this? He doesn't quite answer the question. Notice where he goes instead, though. It is not in vain, nor by chance, that I describe as sisterly the position of truth with respect to jouissance, apart from the fact that I am stating it in the Hysterics discourse. Now, this is a bit of a riddle in the midst of Seminar 17. It's a terrific one, though, because it reminds us that the type of knowledge Lacan is thinking about is one that is always shot through with holes. And with each hole comes a new edge structure, a new littoral zone, where folks can find themselves on the edge of a hole in knowledge and can do the radical scientific work of verifying this limit, inner, outer, extimate, existent, and the like, can do this littoral work of walking the beach and measuring and assessing all the shifting sands there and thereabout. I bring this up because, as we know, it's in Seminar 18 that Lacan gets pretty crisp with all of this and tells us that you have, on the one hand, knowledge, which we have equivalated with land, and jouissance, which is likened to the sea. And where these two overlap, we create a littoral zone, a beach between land and sea. And this Lacan describes as the edge of the hole in knowledge. The littoral zone is the edge of the hole in knowledge. And it's precisely in probing that edge that knowledge as a process unfolds. And it's the discourse of the hysteric that keeps us right on the edge of this hole, ever pronouncing the shifting sands thereof. And I think it's at this point where we see the littoral zone in all of its fullness. Because like any beach, this edge of the hole in knowledge has a low tide mark and a high tide mark. And what I'm trying to get at here is that at high tide, you see an inner edge, and at low tide, you see an outer edge. These two edges are sufficient to describe the edge structure of this hole in knowledge. This edge of the hole in knowledge has an inner limit and an outer limit, high tide and low tide in the littoral zone. That's what we've been working at here. At high tide, we see symptomatic expression commanded by the unconscious. This is all the litter, all the letters, all the debris that washes up and gets stuck at the furthest point that the waves reach. And then at low tide, we see another source of litter and letters. Here is the work of radical scientific inquiry that does the measuring, not the appearing, but the measuring work of assessing, of charting, of mapping Hence the aerial view, again, of Lacan flying over a landscape that gives him this thought. Here is the assessment of what has washed up on the beach. Here is the assessment of just how low the tide will go. Here is the marking of the outer limit of the edge of the whole in knowledge, at which point you're standing on the edge and there's nowhere else to go but out to sea, into this field of jouissance. Radical scientific inquiry, we're learning, and being reminded of from Seminar 17, enjoys being at this outer edge. It enjoys finding this outer limit because it's here at the outer limit of the edge of the whole in any given epistemology, discipline, or discourse that we find ourselves on the verge of truth. And that's the important part of what we're getting here as well. Lacan doesn't say much about truth in this particular section of Seminar 17, but we know where we are in his theory of discourse. The littoral zone is the delta of impotence between the lower two portions of any given Lacanian discourse. And to the left of that delta, beyond that delta, beyond the mountain range that we meet in the field of production, there is this realm of truth. And that's where we have it. Product on the side of land, knowledge. Truth on the side of sea and jouissance. And in between, in this littoral zone, we've got this delta of impotence. And what we're talking about right now is the relationship between that delta of impotence and the position of truth in Lacan's theory of discourse. At this outer edge of the littoral zone, of this hole in knowledge, we find the part of truth that can be said. And that's important here. Symptomatic expression is an example of the part of truth that can be said. It's when the real takes a name, washing up into the symbolic. So also with the radical mathematicizations of the psychoanalytic inquirer. This is somebody who brings a name to the real, trots knowledge right out to the outer edge beyond which it would pass into truth. Here we also see an instance of the part of truth that can be said. So truth has these two parts, as we know, and Lacan's clear on this in 17 as well. There's the part that can be said and the part that cannot be said. The sea beyond low tide is the part that cannot be said. The part that can be said extends from the low tide mark of radical scientific inquiry to the high tide mark of symptomatic expression. That field, that littoral zone where the two circles overlap, that realm of land and sea, mixing it up, churning, constantly grinding, is this field where truth can be said, at least that part of it. And what I want to suggest is what I've been suggesting throughout, that the part of truth that can be said always says more or less the same thing. Beyond this point, I can speak no further. Here I find myself at a limit. There's more to this than can be said. There's more to me than I can say. Now, I would ask you to think about those phrases and ask yourself which one was pronounced by the hysteric and which one was pronounced by the radical scientist. All of these, note, are statements of limitation. They are indications of a barrier or an obstacle beyond which we can speak no further, beyond which Lacan tells us discourse is abolished, beyond which we only see the parts of truth, if we're lucky, that can't be said. What we are talking about here in this littoral zone, marked by the delta of impotence, is real discourse. In any given structure of discourse, there will be this point beyond which we can go no further. But a point at which we can certainly say as much. We can declare this impossibility. We can state this impossibility. We can name this impossibility. And in so doing, we arrive at a discourse that is not a semblance. That's the wager of our reading of Seminar 18, one letter at a time, is that the discourse that might not be a semblance is a real discourse. And we have two versions of it that we're considering, one at high tide and one at low tide. Real discourse looks like the symptomatic expressions that wash up at high tide and the mathematical formulations that can only be seen in those quick moments that we call low tide. These are discourses that are not semblances. These are discourses in which the part of truth that can be said is, but only ever at the level of the letter. It's said in writing. It shows up, it washes up as a bizarre pictographic, cartographic structure. Remember the deer. It's also here, and I want to emphasize this because you know the topic I never tire of speaking of when it comes to Lacanian theory and technique. It's here that we also see the truth of love. It's here that love finds a foothold. It's here that the love of truth that we heard about in Seminar 17 comes back to mind. It's here, let me be precise, that the truth of love emerges in its most profound form, namely as a love of truth, which is also a love of limitation, a love of incompletion, a love of weakness. It is, in short, a love of castration. The truth of love is a love of truth that is a love of castration. Check it out. Seminar 17, page 52, a passage that we've covered before, but that I'd be remiss to leave unread in this context. What is the love of truth? Lacan asks toward the top of 52. A few sentences later, he answers it. The love of truth is the love of this weakness whose veil we have lifted. It's the love of what truth hides, which is called castration. Now, I like the bit here about love of weakness, love of castration. What I notice in hindsight, having read the final two chapters of Seminar 18, is this emphasis on the veil that is lifted, that psychoanalytic theory and technique lifts. The love of truth is the love of this weakness whose veil we have lifted. It's the love of what truth hides, which is called castration. We lift the veil, and behind it we find castration. Hold on to this notion of the veil. It will become relevant again. The discourse of the hysteric, I want to conclude by suggesting, is premised on this love of truth, which is a love of castration. It's a love of truth that can only be pronounced at the edge of the hole in knowledge, where words begin to fail, where words crumble into enigmatic letters, whether at the level of the symptom or at the level of the matheme. And what I want to tell you is that on my reading, all of the letters into which words crumble are love letters, in the precise sense that we are defining love here as a love of weakness. The letters into which words crumble when they crash up on the beach, when they wash up either at high or low tide, they are all love letters in precisely this sense. Now, if you don't think this has anything to do with what's happening with the hysteric, stay tuned, y'all. Check out Chapter 9 of Seminar 18. I think the fun begins around page 164 in the PDF, if you've got that pagination with you. Once more, in Chapter 9, the penultimate chapter in Seminar 18, Lacan is on the topic of love of truth. Check it out. To love the truth, he says, even that which the hysteric incarnates, as one might say. In other words, to give her what one does not have on the pretext that she designates it. Now, wait a minute. That sounds hella familiar. This notion of love as giving what one doesn't have, let's see if that plays out. And you know it does, my friends. We go back to page 52, the page we were just reading from, where we talked about the love of truth as a love of weakness whose veil we have lifted, which is a love of what truth hides, castration. And then we get the riff on impotence, followed by this. It is upon this that everything that has to do with truth is constructed. That there is a love of weakness is no doubt the essence of love. As I have said, love is giving what one doesn't have, namely what might make good this original weakness. The question now is, how does this get wrapped up in the discourse of the hysteric? And Lacan is giving us a clue here in chapter 9 of Seminar 18 in the passage you just heard me read, which I repeat. To love the truth, even that which the hysteric incarnates, as one might say, in other words, to give her what one does not have on the pretext that she designates it. There's something about the discourse of the hysteric that compels the other to give her what they do not have. And this is a key point for us. Indeed, if you look at the structure of the discourse of the hysteric, this is part and parcel of what you see. A barred subject addressing an S1, and the product of that address being an S2, which typically means knowledge. But it's not quite what we're up to. That S2 becomes something quite a bit different in the discourse of the hysteric. The way that we've read this up to this point is that the hysteric, we say, as a barred subject showing up as symptom, with the agency of a symptom and all that we've discussed about this, compels masters of every stripe. There's your S1 in the discourse of the hysteric. The hysteric compels masters of every stripe. And here, as you know, I also include universities. Masters and professors alike. The hysteric compels masters and professors alike to give her what they don't have. Omnipotence in the case of the master, omniscience in the case of the university. The hysteric compels the master to confess his impotence, and the professor to confess his ignorance. Impotence, ignorance, these are the S2s that are produced, not as a knowledge that is had, held, contained, and passed down, but as a knowledge that finds itself at a limit, as the outer limit of what these subject positions can do. The master is powerful, but he is not omnipotent. The professor knows a lot, but they are not omniscient. And the hysteric discourse is the one in which someone shows up in sphinx-like form and compels the master and the university to admit this, to state the limitations of their power, to state the limitations of their knowledge. So the type of knowledge that you see produced in the discourse of the hysteric in the position of S2 is exactly the type of knowledge that we see the radical scientist enjoying in Seminar 17 on page 67. A knowledge at a radical, logical level that opens up onto its own inconsistency. A knowledge that is pronounced as a statement on weakness. A knowledge that admits when it encounters the whole in its very structure. How? This is always the question. How exactly does the hysteric compel professors and masters alike to cough up and confess their limitations. Lacan is very elusive here. He says that she does this by calling them out by name. She calls them by their names, by their S1s. And in so doing, she summons the master and the professor to speak their limits, to pronounce their castration. In short, to tell the truth. The hysteric, when she calls the master by his name, summons him, calls him to the stand, and compels him to tell the truth. And the truth here, as we know, is not a position of strength, but indeed one of weakness, one in which castration can be unveiled. Now, it's tempting to think, in the midst of this, that our dearly beloved hysteric enjoys these confessions. Make no mistake, Lacan's clear on this too. She needs somebody to be castrated. If the hysteric can't find a master, they'll make one. But that's not the source of enjoyment on my reading of the Discourse of the Hysteric. The truth here, her truth, I would like to suggest, reminding you that in the position of truth in the Discourse of the Hysteric, there is objet a. It's different. The truth of her enjoyment is not coming from the field marked by S2, but instead that which is marked by objet a. On my reading, the hysteric enjoys being the cause of these confessions. She doesn't enjoy the pronouncements of weakness themselves. The hysteric enjoys being the cause of these confessions. And I want you to notice this shift that's occurring, where now the hysteric is being feminized. What the hysteric enjoys is being the cause of these confessions, of these admissions of lack, of these admissions of castration, and crucially, of the desires that follow from these admissions of lack. And yet, and this is what we know about the clinical structure of hysteria, but also about the discursive structure of the hysteric, is that while she may enjoy being the cause of the other's desire, she does not enjoy being the object of their satisfaction. And that's a key point here. This is again why little a is positioned in the field of truth in the Discourse of Hysteria. The hysteric not only enjoys bringing masters to heal, this is what Lacan says, she enjoys bringing masters to heal. What I want to add is that she also enjoys being the very thing that tempts them to run wild, ever chasing but never quite catching the tail of their desires. Let me be categorical. Time is short, so let's cut to the chase. The hysteric's love is a love of truth, which is a love of weakness, limitation, and castration, which is why Lacan, at the end of chapter 8 in Seminar 18, insists that the hysterics tell the truth. And what do they tell the truth about? They tell the truth about a certain impossibility, the impossibility of the sexual relationship. It's right at the end of chapter 8 in Seminar 18. What we're adding here at the end of our series, and it's nothing that isn't written all over the final two chapters of 18, by the way, is that the hysteric also loves compelling other people to tell the same truth. She doesn't just enjoy telling the truth about the impossibility of the sexual relationship, she also enjoys compelling others to tell that same truth. And all of these truth-tellings, loved and confessed alike, they all say the same thing when you get down to it. They tell what Lacan calls the truth of a failure, which is no less true anywhere else that the truth is told. To tell the truth is to always tell the truth of a certain failure. And when I say failure, you better damn well think phallus. And not just because you've read Bruce Fink's terrific work on failure, fallibility, and the phallus, but because you've also read Lacan on this point. That's exactly what phallic, masculine surplus enjoyment always is. That shit is fallible. The phallic function, to which all men are wholly subjected, and each woman is partially subjected, is a mark of fallibility sustained by each and every one of us. But some more than others, to be sure. All to some extent, but some more than others. Let me be clear. Phallic enjoyment is enjoyment that often fails. Which brings us to that chase I was telling you about. That chase into which Lacan invites us, lures us, tempts us at the end of Seminar 18, when he recalls the discourse of the hysteric amidst his elusive early formulations of men and women, male and female, masculine and feminine jouissance, in other words, of sexuation. Here it is. Time is short again, so let's get right to it. Is the hysteric a woman? You've been hearing me and you've heard others describe the hysteric as a she, as a her, and so on. Is the hysteric then a fucking woman? Let's just cut right to it. On this point, Lacan, thank goodness, is adamant, outspoken. The hysteric is not a woman. Chapter 9, page 13, 166 in the PDF, if I'm not mistaken. The hysteric is not a woman. What then is the hysteric relative to women? Well, why don't we take another big chance here? What if the hysteric is to innumerable women what the father of the primal horde is to the totalization of all men? And I want you to notice how I'm putting this. The hysteric is to innumerable women what the father of the primal horde is to the countable totalization known as all men. So they are not exactly equivalent if we allow for this thought experiment to unfold. The hysteric is not the mother figure and the father and so on. We're not playing that game. This ain't some heteronuclear bullshit we're working at here. Well, it's a little hetero, and that's part of what I'm so uncomfortable about at this end of Seminar 18, is that Lacan's really pushing this masculine and feminine thing. And, it's, product of an era that is frankly not quite our own. But nevertheless, we find ourselves here in a logical conundrum of sorts. And the question we've been asking is, if we could totalize, collectivize women, as Lacan inclines us to do throughout 18, and then moves in a different direction, but if we could collectivize them, what would be the exceptional woman that guarantees that collection? Now, we're backing away from that a little bit, and not so much asking the question of the universalizability of woman. What we are now asking about is the innumerability of women. And that's what the hysteric brings us to. The hysteric, if she's the mother of anything, she's the mother of quantification. She's the mother of measurement. She's the mother of assessment and variability. What the father of the primal horde is to the totalization of all men, and this is a countable total, a total that has a certain count, n+1 repeated ad infinitum running throughout it, it results in a series of sorts. That's why Lacan is messing around with George I, George II, George III, in the line of kings that he's been toying with in the final chapter of Seminar 18. Men are easily measured. Men are easily numbered, counted, placed into a sequence that can be totalized in this category of all men, I'm suggesting. What the hysteric shows us, though, is that her relation to women is one in which women become innumerable. This is also from chapter 9, page 14, or page 167 in the PDF. Lacan is now referring not to all women, but to innumerable women. I want to suggest, and perhaps this is a big mistake, perhaps by the time we read 19 and 20, we're going to realize, oh, this is all just a complete ridiculousness. I don't care. I'm not tripping about that. I want to take some chances here, though, because I think it's by exploring wrong paths that we can get perspectives, distance, and visions of better ones. And I want to suggest along this potentially wrong path that it's by way of the hysteric that women are positioned on a path of their own. It's by way of the hysteric that women are positioned on the path of non-universalizability, in the logical field of a not all, whose basic structural operation, again, we can write as upside down capital A next to X with a line over the top of it, a horizontal bar. Let's see how this plays out if we were to go ahead and check out some instances in the book. Chapter 9, page 14, has some good paragraphs for us to consider. It's 167 in the PDF. The paragraph begins, and this is where just now I am putting the question. Does this knowledge effectively allow us to make progress with respect to Meno? Now, if you read back a paragraph, you'll see the knowledge in question is knowledge of the unconscious, which is knowledge of the truth. Now, add that to what you've already heard us say about what the truth amounts to and what it means to love the truth, and now you'd be right there in the mix. But notice where he goes, because we've got our eyes set on this hysteric. Namely, is this truth, insofar as it is incarnated in the hysteric, unconscious truth incarnated in the hysteric, the unconscious truth that we unveil in analytic experience is castration, barred subjectivity, and that's precisely how the hysteric shows up. She shows up as a barred subject, symptomatically commanded by the unconscious. You see how this hangs together? This is the theory of agency that we assign to the hysteric when we put a barred S in that upper left-hand position in the discourse of hysteria. It says that when the hysteric shows up and sounds off like a sphinx, what is happening in that moment is that the truth of the unconscious is showing up, namely castration. Castration is walking up and knocking on your door at that point. And the question Lacan asks is a good one here, and it's one that proves that we may indeed have something when we ask the question of the hysteric's relation to women that she is not. Is this truth, insofar as it is incarnated in the hysteric, effectively capable of a subtle enough sliding to be the introduction to a woman? I know well the question has risen by a notch since I proved that there is something that can be articulated in language which cannot for all that be articulated in words, and that it is on that simply that desire is based. Once again, proof that in my reading we need a proper translation in English of Seminar 18. And it doesn't get better in this paragraph either, so hang on. It is nevertheless easy to settle. It is precisely because what is at stake is desire, insofar as it puts the emphasis on the invariance of the unknown which is on the left, the one that is only produced under the heading verneinung, meaning negation. It is precisely because it puts the emphasis on the invariance of the unknown that obviously what belongs to desire cannot be inscribed by analysis in any function of a variable. Now you can imagine which part of the discourse of the hysteric he's talking about here. This is the stumbling block, inviting you to imagine another part, by which there is separated as such the desire of the hysteric from what nevertheless is produced, a product, in the Discourse of the Hysteric, and allows innumerable women to function as such, namely by playing the function of the pas plus d'un, which is a combination of words basically translating as not more than one. Pas plus d'un. He's messing around with words, you know. A function of the pas plus d'un of their being for all their situational variations. Now, I'll leave you to go back to the French, chop this up, work through the pas, the plus, and the d'un to arrive at this not more than one. The stake that I want to point out is a much simpler one. It's that the hysteric, in doing whatever it is that she, they, he is doing, is somehow paving the way for innumerable women. Continuing on, bottom of page 167 in our PDF. The hysteric here plays the role of functional schema, if you know what that means. And that's a very important part here. If the hysteric is not a woman, it's because she is a functional schema. The hysteric is a discourse, not a person, if you know what I mean. This is the import of my formula of desire described as unsatisfied. It can be deduced from this that the hysteric is situated by introducing the pas plus d'un, by which each one of the women is established along the path of, it is not of every woman that it can be said that she is a function of the phallus. Now that's a pretty tough sentence. We'll come back to it in a second. That this is the case with every woman is what constructs her desire as that. That is why this desire is sustained as being unsatisfied. Man, if there's some paragraphs to go back to and chop up and really try and make sense of from French back into English, I'd say this is the second one. The fact is that a woman results from it, but one who cannot be the hysteric in person. This, indeed, is how she incarnates my earlier truth, the one that after having made it speak, I restored to its structural function. These two paragraphs are terrific, but it's the first line of the next paragraph that gives us the clue to what is at stake here for Lacan. The psychoanalytic discourse is established by this restoration of her truth to the hysteric. And this is precisely what you see. The structure of the discourse of the hysteric, if you give it a quarter turn clockwise, what you see is a progression from the discourse of the hysteric to that of the analyst. Objet A comes up from the position of truth and now occupies the position of the agent. Barred subjectivity slides to the right, no longer being the position of the agent, but now the other addressed by that agent. And what drops down into the position of product as we progress from the discourse of the hysteric to that of the analyst? An S1, which is not the master, which is not the university. This is a different type of utterance, a symptomatic expression that is doing what all symptomatic expressions do. In the discourse of analysis, the S1 you've heard me say in this series, the S1 here is a statement of one's limits. A statement that shows the subject, the analysand, at the base of a very certain mountain range, marked by the delta of impotence. The point here is that psychoanalysis progresses from hysteria. This is a structural argument, it's a conceptual argument, but as you probably know, it's also a historical fact. Freud cuts his teeth on the hysteric. What the hysteric compels the master to admit, hear me now, is precisely the part of self that psychoanalysis addresses, that field and function of castration. That's what's at stake for us conceptually in this progression of a quarter turn. from the discourse of the hysteric to that of the analyst. But I told you I would come back to this wild little sentence around the hysteric and putting women on a certain path. That's what you see in chapter 9 on page 14 or 167. And this sentence I want to call your attention to is an important one. The hysteric is situated by introducing the not more than one, by which each one of the women is established along the path, a certain path. And what is this path? It's the path that you see represented in Lacan's formulation that has an upside down A next to an X with a horizontal bar above it, next to his formula for the phallic function. And it reads like this, because remember, women are not universalizable the same way that men are. It is not of every woman that it can be said that she is a function of the phallus. It's a very smart way, I believe, to read this early formulation in Lacan's thought around feminine sexuality and enjoyment. It is not of every woman that we can say that she is a function of the phallus. Something about the discourse of the hysteric puts women on this path, in this realm, on this beachhead where the formula to be expressed on the edge of the whole in knowledge is the one that looks like an upside down AX with a line over the top of it next to the phallic function. And notice, as I shift back to the littoral zone, where all of this would be occurring. We are not at high tide in the littoral zone, where symptoms commanded by the unconscious wash up in all of their hysterical forms, curvatures, and the like. We are instead now at low tide, the tide point where the formulas are written, the low water mark, in another form of pure writing, namely that of the radical psychoanalytic theorist, with all of his phe's of X written on the blackboard of the night sky. It's the hysteric, wielding the agency of the symptom, that conditions the psychoanalytic work of writing what cannot be said about the truth of woman. That's how I'm reading this sentence here. Yes, the discourse of the hysteric conditions the discourse of the analyst. A quarter turn in one produces the other. Yes, there's a historical argument to be made that the hysteric that stumbles into Lacan or into Freud's care is precisely what gets the wheel of psychoanalysis started. Absolutely, those are valid arguments. The point I'm making here, though, is that it's the discourse of the hysteric when she shows up as a symptomatic expression that doesn't just force the master in the university to confess their limitations. The hysteric in this moment also conditions the work of psychoanalytic theory at the level of the formula, at the level of a pure writing of what cannot be said about the truth of a woman. And this is the second formula for feminine enjoyment that Lacan gives us, which looks kind of wild. This one has the backwards E next to X with a bar over the top. And then it's got a phallic function formula with a bar over the top of that. It's a double barred. It's double negated. What the hell's going on here? This is the formula that allows the psychoanalytic work to occur. And here's what it sounds like. There is not one woman who is not defined by the phallic function. It's written in this very elusive formula that functions as a double negation and all on purpose, not to confound us, but to try and put us on the edge of a figure and form and function of enjoyment that eludes the phallic function. In other words, that cannot readily pass into the symbolic. We can nevertheless put it in the realm of the symbolic at the level of speech. We can try and talk it in, at the risk of losing much of what's at stake in the double negation. We can reverse the double negation to state it clearly, coherently, and accessibly as follows. You can't find a single woman who isn't partially subjected to the phallic jouissance that we see occurring in the wake of castration. You can't find one who isn't at least a little bit castrated. That's a good way to translate this, but I want you to remember that there's something very difficult to speak through around this second formulation with the double horizontal bars above it around feminine sexuality. And this is part of what the discourse of the hysteric allows. She shows up as symptom so that Freud via Lacan and Lacan via Freud can come up with this formula at the low tide mark that accounts for her appearance. At the risk of putting too much of a point on this, but also really in a way that I think brings Lacan to the concluding comments of Seminar 18, I want to call your attention to page 9 of chapter 10. It's page 183 in the PDF. We're right at the end of Seminar 18, and Lacan is still hot on this relationship between the discourse of the hysteric and the work of the radical psychoanalytic theorist. Notice he returns again and again to the discourse of the hysteric in these final chapters. Here's how it starts. Let us come now to the hysteric, because I like to start from the hysteric to see where the thread leads us. And don't forget, we're on a chase here. The hysteric, we have asked ourselves, have we not, what it is, but precisely this is the meaning. It is to such a question. What is it? What is it? What does it mean? The hysteric in person? It seems to me that I have worked for a long enough time starting from the imaginary to indicate that in person, to recall simply what is already inscribed in the terms in person, a mask. No reply can be given at the start to this meaning. Here's the key point. To the question, what is the hysteric? The answer of the discourse of the analyst is, you'll see. You will indeed see precisely by following where she leads us. Without the hysteric, of course, there would never have come to light what is involved in what I am writing. Of what I am writing anyway, I am trying to give you the first logical step of what is now at stake, of what I write as phi of x, which is namely that enjoyment, this variable in the function written in x, is not situated from this relationship to the capital I with a circle through it, that here designates the phallus, the central discovery, or rather rediscovery, as you wish, rebaptism, since I indicated to you why it is from the phallus as an unveiled semblance in the mysteries. There's that emphasis on veiling and now unveiling back at you. That the term is taken up again and not by chance. That it is very precisely, in effect, that it is to the semblance of the phallus that there is referred the pivotal point, the center of everything that can be organized, be contained in terms of sexual enjoyment, that from the first approaches to hysterics, from the studies on hysteria, Freud leads us. Now, a couple of things really nicely noted here. First, you've got the in-person bit. Part of the dilemma, part of the reason why the hysteric is not a woman is because the hysteric is a structure, and women are always in person. The second part, though, is if you want to know the answer to the question, what is the hysteric, you got to wait and see. This emphasis on you'll see, the analyst says. The analyst says you will indeed see precisely by following where she leads us. How and where do we see what the hysteric is? We see what the hysteric is in writing, on the page, on the blackboard, in the diagram of the Discourse of the Hysteric that shows a barred subject addressing an S1, forcing them to admit, to confess their limitations in the form of an S2, all at the behest of a position of truth, where objet A sits squarely. This is where we see what the hysteric is, in writing. Again, at the level of the analytic blackboard with all of its phe's of X. But what about this last part? This last part in the passage you just heard me read about the phallus as an unveiled semblance. Where exactly do we see a semblance of the phallus that can be revealed as such? How about in the Discourse of the Hysteric, when it compels the master to speak in the place of the phallus? This is a really key point. It's in chapter 10, page 15, right at the end of things in seminar 18, page 189 in the PDF, where Lacan says that when the hysteric calls the master by name, summoning him to speak, she does so in a way that compels them to speak in the place of the phallus. You can summon the phallus itself as often as you like, Lacan says, but it will always say the same thing, namely nothing. Masters, however, speak. And professors like me, of course, we never shut the hell up. Which is why I'm so delighted to be having this conversation at the end of our series on Seminar 18, beyond which we can speak no further. But here's the thing. Masters and professors, they only show up and they only start talking when you call them by name. And the name of the master and the professor is always the same, some variation on daddy. It's in the name of the Father that we see a semblance of the phallus. And in the speech of those who answer to this name, an opportunity to unveil these motherfuckers for what they are. And what are they? What is the master and what is the university? They're wannabes. The master, the professor, the analyst even, with all of their diplomas mounted on their clinic walls, alongside all of their Lacan books, of course, they are all wannabe fathers. And in the Discourse of the Hysteric, all of this is laid bare. The truth of the master is that he's castrated, just like you and me. And compared to all the women on this call, even more so. But that's not the fantasy of the master. The fantasy of the master is that he's the big dog. The fantasy of the master is that he just might be the real man whose uncut daddy dick gets access to all the women, if you follow along with the myth of the father of the primal horde. The fantasy of omnipotence in the case of the master, the fantasy of omniscience in the case of the professor. These are examples of semblances of power, of mastery, of omniscience, of divine authority, structured atop a truth that can't be born, namely castration. Enter the hysteric. It's in the Discourse of the Hysteric that all of this comes to light, that all of this is exposed, that all of the false semblance of agency that we see in masters and professors alike is laid bare. This fantasy of omnipotence and omniscience, nay, let's call it what it is once more. We are talking about semblances of mastery, semblances of unlimited agential power in the fields of mastery and knowledge alike. All of this belies the truth, which is the only truth that can ever be spoken. It's the very one that props up masculinity itself. And here's how I would put it here at the end of things. It's this wonderfully homoerotic fantasy that somewhere, somehow, there's a man, a real man, who enjoys without limit, without constraint, in an uncut, wholly uncastrated state. And that, guess what? You just might be him. The master just might be that uncut daddy. The professor just might be that uncut daddy. The analyst with all their books on the shelf just might be that uncut daddy, keeper of all things Lacanian. And anybody who's worked in the Lacanian translation field knows who the wannabe daddy is here. So here's my question, though. Here's my question in all this. Shitting aside, what then is the father? Wasn't this the core question of so much of Freud's thought? Here's the thing. The father is a name, but it's a name that implies a certain faith, which in turn props up a certain law. And there's some ambiguity in Lacan's French at the end of chapter 10 that the translator, bless his heart, also kept as well, so that we can see a little bit of this slippage between faith and law that the name of the father implies. You can check it out. It's on page 13 of chapter 10, 187 in our PDF. Holler back at me. We can talk more about it. But I'm moving fast. We're at the end of things. I want to suggest that it's this law that, as we've seen before, has a sexual tenor to it. The law in question here is the sexual law that we heard earlier on in the first half of Seminar 18. It's a law in and as which forbidden jouissance, that sexual jouissance we just heard about again, exists, but only as a stated prohibition against itself. In short, as a name of the real. And who, my dear friends, lays down this sexual law? We know that it's laid down, but who does it? Who lays down the sexual law? Now, the obvious answer is not the one I want to end with. I want to suggest that we might get some productivity out of this question by suggesting that it's not the father of the primal horde, this no thing, this pronouncer of prohibition, who lays down the sexual law. What if we turned this a little bit and instead focused on the hysteric? It's here at the end of our series on Seminar 18 that I want to risk this rather unusual answer, an answer that nevertheless, I think if you read the final two chapters of 18 carefully, is on the tip of Lacan's tongue. Namely, once more, that it's not the father of the primal horde who lays down the sexual law, but the hysteric at the origin of psychoanalytic theory and technique who lays down the sexual law. That's an interesting and probably completely bonkers approach to this, but it's an invitation for us to think in a different direction. And that's really what this is about. It's not just about clear, coherent, and accessible readings. It's also about the types of productive, wild, new turns that can emerge, the new formulas and diagrams that can emerge when you just focus on trying to read the text. And it's in this diagrammatic structural progression that we've been fucking with here, where a quarter turn clockwise in the hysteric produces the discourse of the analyst, that I want to say we see an opportunity to come to terms with this possibility that it's the hysteric, not the father, who lays down the sexual law. What does it mean to hystericize the master, as Lacan increasingly envisions the work of the analyst in the analytic discourse, where little a addresses the barred subject? This is a hystericization of the analysand. To hystericize the analysand is to compel them to name the split subjectivity atop which they are structured, a split subjectivity that they can no longer deny. And how do they name this? In that S1, the product that we see once more emerging from the analytic experience is an S1. This S1 is a newfangled master signifier. It's a signifier that causes the analysand's speech to grind to a halt. It ruptures the analytic experience. Everything stops. Some things go, but most everything stops in this moment with the pronouncement of this new S1, a symptomatic expression. This is symptom 1, baby. In this newfangled name, this S1 produced in the discourse of the analyst, I'd like to conclude by saying I think we see a name of the real discourse, a discourse in which S1 at long last is no longer a semblance, but instead a semblance unveiled.